Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first official episode of The Curtain and the Cross. Sorry, I made a joke with Grace before we started recording that I didn't realize how much our title kind of sounds like a country song, but that's okay because country music has kind of like a Christian background to it, doesn't it?
It does, and I'm definitely here for it.
Yeah. So I'm actually really, really excited about the show. I've had this idea in my mind for a while because I am a Christian and I also teach theater in the public school system. And so it's just very interesting to try to be a Christian in an environment where you can't really talk about it. And so that's what this show is going to be all about. It's going to be how Grace and I and a few of our friends who feel like stopping by, how we go through this journey of teaching children and being a witness and teaching them about the creativity that God has given them. And how do we just handle all of that? But before we dive into any of that stuff, Grace, would you like to tell our listeners why is it that you and I are doing this show?
Yeah, so Nathan and I met at a wonderful conference called Fall Sharing in last fall, obviously, 2024. Right away, we had a mutual friend, so we started hanging out and talking, and we were talking about how we got started in theater, and Nathan was talking about a Christian camp he did, and he did acting through that, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I did like some Christian theater too. I like did a camp at like homeschool conferences and stuff. So from there, we were able to talk about our faith in Christianity and sharing it in our fields in theater. We then went on to talk about movies because Nathan has another little plug for his other podcast that is amazing. If you haven't heard of that, please listen to it, which I had the opportunity to come and be a part of one episode, and it was amazing. And then Nathan came up with this idea about like taking both of our passion for the Lord and our job for theater and making a podcast. So that's what's bringing us here, and I'm really excited.
Yeah, I ventured in this kind of podcasting thing before with another show called Cultural Christianity when I worked at a private Christian school. I did the show with a fellow teacher who was a pastor, and we did a couple of episodes. And then I started to realize that the phrase cultural Christianity has a very negative connotation to it nowadays. And so I was like, maybe that's why the show wasn't doing that well. And then my friend had to drop out of the show. And so that kind of fizzled away. But I've always had this passion to have another way of sharing my faith and sharing, like Grace said, our mutual passion for theater as well. So I wanted to also take this episode to kind of go into a little bit of our testimonies. And that's obviously our testimonies on how we met Christ, but also kind of how we've maneuvered our way through the theater world as Christians. Because one thing that Grace and I discussed is that we both got to a point where the theater world is tricky and it's hard to stand up for Christ. Now, I'm not saying that I don't know people who are Christians who continue to do theater. That's actually one of my friends, Matthew Jackson, will hopefully hop on an episode in the future. He is a Christian and he also does theater. So I'm excited to talk to him about that. But I felt like the atmosphere and the environment that I had been a part of for so long and felt like it was a sense of community started to feel like a place that I didn't belong anymore. Did you feel that way too with theater when you were doing it?
Yeah, so theater, as wonderful as it is, as inclusive and as a sense of belonging, which are all, especially the sense of belonging and caring and love, is a very huge Christian value. And it's also really big in theater, but just the theater world pushes those other beliefs too that are not biblical. And I just felt myself getting dragged into a different mindset that was not Christ centered or safe to be surrounded with constantly.
Yeah. And so I decided, for the sake of my sanity, for the sake of my faith, for the sake of my family, it would be wise for me just to take a step back, maybe indefinitely, maybe forever, from theater. It was a very hard decision because it was something I was very passionate about, and I love performing. I love being in front of an audience, but I get to kind of do that in a way and spark that magic into my students. And so that's the main reason we're talking about this. Also, like I said, I wanted to go into our testimonies of how we met Christ. So this is crazy because Grace and I met in the fall, so we don't really know each other that crazy well. And so that's what's cool about this journey too, is that and during this conversation and the conversations we have in the future, we're kind of getting to know each other as friends as well. So that's really cool. So I was actually born 5 weeks premature in 1986. I was supposed to be born like late October, early November. And so when I was born, the doctors basically told my parents that I was not going to make it past the age of 2. And if I did, I wouldn't really be able to do much because of all the complications that came with that. And of course, almost 39 years later, proving doctors wrong. But even with that miracle in my life, I kind of blamed God for a lot of the hospital visits that I had to have. My right lung collapsed 2 times, my left lung collapsed 1 time. I had surgery when I was a baby, so I don't have the ability to throw up. I know, TMI. So I've had medical complications with that. And there were moments where I would be laying, like, I would literally be in a hospital bed, looking out the window and just being like, why? Why are you doing this? And I grew up in a Christian home. Grew up, my dad was a youth pastor, my mom sung in the worship. And so I grew up around that. But it wasn't until I was 13 years old in youth group, and I just felt, that, how they say, you felt that tug about, God saying, it's time for you to come and trust me. I've been with you for 13 years. It's time to recognize that I have a calling for you and a plan for you. And so when I was 13, I accepted Christ. But obviously, as most people do, they still have troubles and issues. I was engaged one time before while I lived in Florida, because of bad choices I made. We broke that off. But if I hadn't have broke that off, I wouldn't have moved back home, and I wouldn't have met my wife that I have now, and I wouldn't have my 2 beautiful children. So God has just been guiding me this whole time. And I think in a future episode, we'll talk about that. Even though I've been through a lot of hiccups when it comes to the school system too, I've noticed that God has provided, and he's been with me every step of the way. And I noticed that every time I would go to a different school, because I've taught at probably four schools, and again, we'll talk about that probably in a later episode. But each school taught me a little bit more about who God has called me to be as a teacher. And so instead of looking at it as devastation when I've had to leave some schools, or looking at it as like burning bridges when I've had to leave some schools, I've seen it as God is getting me to a place where I'm 100% confident in myself as a teacher. And so that's kind of like a mixture of my journey to God and my journey as a theater teacher. And so, Grace, would you like to share your testimony?
Sure. Yours is super powerful, by the way. That is definitely can tell by like just the interactions I've had with you so far and what I've come to know about you, how you are very God-centered. Like you are doing everything with his hand, and admire that. That's awesome. My testimony, for the most part, is like a lot of other people. I grew up in the church. I was actually homeschooled. So K through 12, my education was very heavily influenced by the Bible, which is not a bad thing at all. And my husband jokes that I know more about the Bible than any other subject, but I don't see that's anything bad with it. So, but because I was around the Bible so much and it was so constant, we were at church every Sunday, every Wednesday. If anything needed done at the church, our family was there all the time. People from church would be at our house all the time. Growing up as a teenager, youth group would meet at my house. We'd have bonfires and swim parties and all the things, mission trips growing up. So just, never had a life without church. And even though I had church, I don't know looking back if I always had Christ though as that relationship, that one-on-one, because yes, I knew who he was. I knew loved him. And at 9 years old, I accepted him as my Lord and Savior because I thought I knew everything. I knew that I needed to pray. I knew he was my friend. I knew that he was there for me if I needed him. But did I? Because I was asking for things like a new friend or a new outfit I wanted. Like, Jesus, can you bring this to me? Can you help this? Or praying for my friend who was sick. It was not a relationship, more as a wish list was my relationship with Christ. Then, as I got older, especially my early years in college, I started dating and I started dating guys who were religious, but I started relying on their faith more than my own. So it was more of almost looking at to them as my God instead of having a personal relationship for myself. So when all of those blew up and I was like, oh, it's just me. Like, what? I have to make my own relationship with this almighty power that knows all of the things and he wants to hear from me. It messed with me. I was like, it took a little bit to be able to figure it out and be able to know that God wants to hear from me. He wants to know those little things and to build that relationship. So through the FCA at my college and growing closer to him and having friendships that were healthy and not relying on them, I was able to build a personal relationship with Christ. And I realized that his calling for me, although I loved theater and I wanted to go do all the things and move to New York and all that fun stuff, I always had a calling to work with children. And I thought, oh, it's just because I have so many siblings. I have 5 siblings, by the way. So I was like, I'm just good with kids. It's fine. I've had nieces and nephews. It's what I'm used to. But it took God to be like, no, this is your thing. This is what you're calling. So you love theater and you love kids. So put them together. And I was working in music for a little bit and it was really difficult. I was having the drive an hour, which doesn't sound that bad, but I also loved that extra hour of sleep and I was struggling. And a theater job 20 minutes from my house showed up on my Facebook and I was like, God, all right. And here I am 4 years later and best decision that I've ever made.
Girl, you have no idea how much our stories when it comes to like feeling God calling us to do teach theater, like our stories are so like because I always felt called to children's ministry. Like that was my heart. And I always felt like I couldn't really be a minister to children without being a children's pastor. I actually minored in children's ministry when I went to college in Florida. And when I wasn't able to get my minor in children's ministry, I was really devastated. I was like, man, what am I going to do? I have this theater degree that's kind of pointless. And then one day, out of the blue, somebody messaged me on Facebook about a theater teacher position at an elementary school. And I was like, because for a while, a lot of people, I mean, for years, people had said, Nathan, you should teach. Like, why don't you teach? I'm like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to go to school every day and wake up like you said. I like my sleep, but I trusted this person that messaged me, and so I went to this elementary school and I fell in love with it. I teach elementary theater now, and it was exactly like what you said. What God was calling me to was theater and working with kids, and I got to put them together. And so it's just been, it's been a rough road at times, because of going from school to trying to do 2 months in high school, which is what you teach. You teach high school, right?
Yes, I teach high school theater. I started a year with elementary, but none of my schools around here offer theater anywhere but the high school level. So I was like, it was either high school or little kids. And I was like, you know what, I'll try high school. But honestly, those high schoolers need love just as much as those elementary school kids. They're just not as open to letting you know. Like they all need Jesus.
What's really cool about it is, being able to be that light in an environment that again doesn't allow you to vocally speak about it, but you get to be that example that a lot of these kids probably don't have. And you get to, yeah, you get just to share the creativity, and it's just awesome. And I can't wait to talk about that more on this show, and because that's what this show is all about, diving into that creativity that God has called us to have. Because one of the mottos I say, and I think probably a lot of pastors say it, is we've been created to be creative, and we've been created by a creative God to do some amazing things. And so when we rely on him, he gives us the tools that we need. Because I know when I first started teaching, I was scared out of my mind. I felt like I was being thrown out into the wolves, and I had no one to guide me. But, almost 10 and a half years later, I'm still teaching, and it's a blessing, and it's awesome. So I'm excited for this journey on the curtain and the cross. Sorry, I'm going to say it like that every time now. I kind of want to redo our theme to make it a country song. Just saying.
You're gonna
So,
have to come up with a nice little slogan or intro for it as well.
oh, definitely. So, another thing I want to try to do with this show is I want us to interact with our listeners. And one way we're going to do that is I'm going to create an email specifically for this show that people can email us questions, things that they want to talk about, because I know I have a lot of fellow Christian public school teacher friends who saw that we were doing the show, and they seem pretty excited about it. So I know I'll have some people who might want to ask us questions, or maybe hop on an episode in the future and talk about what they feel like it's like to be a Christian in the public school system. So, Grace, I'm so excited. Are you excited?
I am excited. And I also want to just tag on to what you said about the email. If anyone too, like just thespian Christians out there as well, like if you're in the theater world anywhere and you have a story or something or a question that you want to send in and share that we can address here, that'd be super cool as well.
Yeah. So this has been the first official episode. Oh, I'm so excited. I've had this idea for so long, and so it's finally coming to life. The curtain and the cross. It's either going to be a bi-weekly, monthly, depending on the interaction we get from the show. We want to know how popular we are before we commit to to something like, oh, every week, bi-weekly. We'll see. But I'm no matter what, I'm excited, and God's going to do amazing things. Thank you for listening to The Curtain and the Cross. This is Nathan and
Grace.
signing out.